The wind howled through the pines, a bitter whisper that scraped against the cabin's walls. Sawyer Boone leaned closer to the crackling fire, rough hands wrapped around a tin cup, the warmth leaching into his cold, calloused fingers. Outside, snow fell thick and heavy, smothering the world in a silence that felt like a shroud. Then he heard it, a distant, sharp cry cutting through the storm. Not the mournful howl of wolves, but something more human, more desperate. His pulse quickened. He reached for his rifle, the polished wood cool and familiar in his grip. Sawyer hesitated for only a breath before pushing open the door, the wind slamming against him like a wall. Snowflakes stung his face, and his boots crunched against the frozen ground as he moved toward the sound. The storm swallowed his steps, erasing them before he'd even taken the next. Ahead, the dark shapes of trees leaned together like whispering ghosts. And then he saw her, a figure crumpled in the snow, blood staining the white around her like a cruel blossom. The wolves were already circling, yellow eyes glinting in the shadows. Sawyer leveled his rifle, the cold steel steady in his hands, and fired into the night. Sawyer Boone moved through the snow, his boots crunching through the thick, frozen drifts as the wind whipped at his face. The rifle in his hands felt solid, a comforting weight against the biting cold. The night had swallowed the last of the daylight, leaving only the faintest glimmer of moonlight filtering through the pine branches overhead. The air was sharp enough to cut, each breath like a blade against his throat. He reached the edge of the tree line and paused, breath misting in front of his face. The cabin sat low against the hillside, a small plume of smoke winding up into the star-pocked sky. His cabin, built with his own two hands, log by log, each piece set with more anger than hope. It had been a refuge, a place where he could be alone with his thoughts, his regrets, his ghosts. But now something had disturbed the stillness. The wolves' howls had been growing more frequent, closer each night. But this time it was different. He'd heard a cry, a human cry, sharp and full of a terror that didn't belong to the wild. His heart had skipped at the sound, a low, primal dread settling into his bones. As he stepped into the clearing, he saw the tracks, shallow, half filled with fresh snow, leading down toward the frozen creek. He followed them, his breath coming in sharp bursts now, mist rising like the spirits of the dead in the moonlight. The trees crowded closer as he descended, the wind whispering through the branches, the snow crunching louder beneath his feet. Then he saw it, a dark shape in the snow, small and motionless, half covered in a drift. He raised his rifle, his eyes narrowing as he approached. It was a woman, her hair splayed out around her like the wings of a blackbird, her clothes torn and blood-stained. Wolves circled her, their eyes reflecting the moonlight like shattered glass. One of them, larger than the rest, bared its teeth, a low growl rumbling deep in its throat. Sawyer's finger tightened on the trigger. He fired into the air, the crack of the shot echoing off the trees, scattering the wolves into the shadows. They vanished into the dark, their howls trailing off into the distance. He moved quickly to the woman's side, kneeling in the snow. Her skin was cold, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps, a dark wound staining her side. "Damn it," he muttered, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. He scooped her up, her body limp and frighteningly light in his arms. She didn't stir as he carried her back through the snow, her head lolling against his chest, her dark hair brushing against his face. The cabin loomed ahead, its windows glowing faintly, the only warmth in an otherwise frozen world. Sawyer kicked open the door, nearly stumbling as he crossed the threshold. He laid her gently on the small cot by the fire, her limbs awkwardly sprawled, her breathing still shallow. He tossed more wood onto the fire, the flames crackling and hissing as they reached for the dry kindling. The heat slowly began to seep into the room, melting the ice from his beard, thawing his stiff fingers. He grabbed a tin cup from the table, pouring steaming water into it from the kettle hanging above the fire. He knelt beside the woman, brushing the snow from her face, revealing skin as pale as the winter outside. He hesitated for a moment, then pulled a rough woolen blanket from the foot of the cot, wrapping it tightly around her. "Stay with me," he muttered, not sure if he was talking to her or to himself. He turned back to the fire, grabbing a handful of dried herbs from a small pouch on the mantel. He crushed them between his calloused fingers, letting the sharp, medicinal smell fill his nose as he mixed them into the steaming water. He lifted her head carefully, pressing the cup to her cracked, bloodless lips. She sputtered, a small, weak sound escaping her throat before the warm liquid slid past her teeth. He felt a flicker of relief, but it was quickly smothered by the cold reality of the situation. She needed more than warmth and water. She needed time, and out here, in the middle of nowhere, that was a luxury they couldn't afford. Sawyer sank back onto the stool by the fire, rubbing his hands together, his mind racing. Who was she? Where had she come from? And what had left her bleeding in the snow, surrounded by wolves? He glanced at the rifle leaning against the wall, the firelight glinting off its polished barrel. Whatever had happened, it wasn't over. Not yet. Outside, the wind howled again, a lonely, mournful sound that cut through the night. Sawyer tightened his grip on his knees, staring into the fire, trying to ignore the chill creeping back into his bones. The night stretched long and thin, and for the first time in years, Sawyer Boone was not alone. The fire crackled softly, throwing long shadows against the cabin walls. Sawyer sat on the edge of the cot, his eyes locked on the woman's pale face. Her breathing had steadied, each shallow rise and fall of her chest a fragile promise that life still clung to her battered body. He had bandaged the gash at her side with the strips of a torn shirt, the blood already seeping through, staining the white cloth a dark, angry crimson. He leaned back, rubbing a rough hand over his stubbled jaw. Questions swirled in his mind, sharp and relentless as the wind outside. Who was she? How had she ended up bleeding in the snow, surrounded by wolves? And what kind of trouble had she brought to his doorstep? The woman stirred, a small pained sound escaping her lips. Sawyer leaned in, his rough hands hovering uncertainly over her. Her eyes fluttered open, dark and unfocused, blinking against the flickering firelight. For a moment she looked right through him, her gaze slipping past his shoulder, into the shadows beyond. Then her eyes fixed on his, a flash of fear cutting through the haze. "Easy," he said, his voice low and rough from disuse. "You're safe now." Her body tensed, her fingers clenching the thin wool blanket he had wrapped around her. She tried to sit up, a strangled gasp escaping her as the movement pulled at her wounded side. Sawyer's hand shot out, steadying her before he even realized what he was doing. She stiffened at his touch, dark eyes narrowing, but she didn't pull away. "Rest," he said firmly, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You're hurt. You need to lie still." She stared at him, her eyes sharp and searching, as if trying to gauge his intentions. He felt a flicker of unease under her scrutiny, the kind that came from being judged and found lacking. Finally, she sagged back against the cot, her breath coming in short, pained gasps. Sawyer stood and turned to the fire, grabbing the kettle and pouring more steaming water into the tin cup. He crushed another handful of dried herbs into the cup, letting the sharp, medicinal smell fill the small cabin. The scent reminded him of the old trapper who had taught him the ways of the wild, a man long dead, his bones likely picked clean by the same wolves that had circled this woman. He knelt beside the cot again, pressing the warm cup to her lips. She hesitated, eyes flicking from the cup to his face, before parting her cracked lips just enough to let the liquid pass. She grimaced at the bitter taste but forced herself to swallow, each gulp a small act of defiance. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice a low rumble in the stillness. He hadn't meant to speak, the question slipping out before he could stop it. She blinked, her brow furrowing as if the words took a moment to reach her. Her lips moved, a faint whisper escaping them, but he couldn't make it out. He leaned in closer, the firelight casting deep shadows over her sharp, high cheekbones and dark eyes that still held a spark of defiance despite the blood loss and pain. "Maya," she whispered, the word barely a breath. Sawyer sat back on his heels, the name echoing in his mind. Maya. It felt strange in his mouth, foreign, like a song in a language he had long forgotten. He watched as her eyes slid shut again, her lashes casting faint shadows against her cheeks. She was drifting back into unconsciousness, her body too battered to sustain awareness for long. Sawyer pushed himself to his feet, crossing to the small frost-covered window. Outside, the snow had picked up again, the wind throwing icy fists against the cabin walls. He could hear the faint, mournful howls of the wolves in the distance, their voices rising and falling in a haunting, discordant chorus. He clenched his fists, his knuckles cracking in the cold. He had no idea what trouble this woman had brought to his door, but he knew one thing for certain. Whatever had left her bleeding in the snow would come looking for her, and when it did, it would find him waiting. Sawyer turned back to the fire, his shadow stretching long across the wooden floorboards. He picked up his rifle, running his calloused fingers over the polished stock, the weight of it a cold, reassuring presence in his hands. He leaned it against the wall beside the door, within easy reach. The woman, Maya, shivered under the thin blanket, a small, broken sound escaping her lips as the fire crackled and spat. Sawyer sank back onto the stool by the hearth, his eyes never leaving her. He had spent years alone, his life carved out of the wilderness with blood and bone. But this felt different, dangerous. The wind screamed outside and Sawyer Boone tightened his grip on his knees, jaw set, eyes hard. Whatever storm had brought this woman to his doorstep, he would face it head on. He had no other choice. The storm outside had grown teeth. Wind howled through the gaps in the cabin walls, rattling the shutters and forcing icy tendrils of air to creep across the floor. The fire crackled in defiance, its warmth a small, stubborn flame against the cold that gnawed at the logs stacked outside the door. Sawyer watched Maya's shallow breaths, the rise and fall of her chest barely lifting the worn blanket draped over her. She had slipped back into unconsciousness, her body limp, lips tinged with a faint blue from the blood she had lost. He leaned in, pressing the back of his hand to her forehead. She was cold, too cold, and her skin felt clammy beneath his rough, calloused fingers. He cursed under his breath, grabbing a second blanket from the foot of his cot and wrapping it tightly around her. He knew the signs of a body giving up, the slow, inevitable slip into darkness. He had seen it before, held a friend's hand as he shivered his last breath on a freezing mountain pass. The memory twisted like a knife in his gut. He crossed to the fire, his boots scuffing against the rough wooden floor. Grabbing the battered kettle, he poured steaming water into the tin cup, adding a handful of dried leaves and roots. The sharp, bitter smell filled the cabin, clinging to the walls and his clothes. He took a deep breath, letting the warmth fill his lungs, the familiarity of the ritual calming his racing mind. As he turned back to Maya, he hesitated. She had stirred, her head turning slightly, dark hair falling across her face. He moved closer, kneeling beside the cot, and gently brushed the strands away from her cheek. Her skin felt like cold marble under his touch, but her eyes fluttered, slowly cracking open. For a moment their gazes locked. She blinked, her eyes unfocused, the firelight casting flickering shadows across her sharp features. He watched as confusion twisted her expression, fear following close behind. Her fingers twitched, gripping the edge of the blanket as if she could pull herself back from the brink of whatever nightmare had swallowed her. "Easy," he whispered, his voice rough. "You're safe here." Her breath hitched, a small pained sound escaping her. She tried to sit up, her body stiff and uncooperative. Sawyer's hand shot out, steadying her shoulder before she could topple off the cot. She froze at his touch, her dark eyes wide like a deer cornered by a hunter. He pulled his hand back slowly, holding it up in a gesture of peace. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his voice low but firm. "You're safe." She watched him for a moment longer, her chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. Slowly the fear in her eyes faded, replaced by something harder, something that looked like determination. She sank back against the thin pillow, her fingers still clenched in the blanket's rough fabric. Sawyer let out a slow breath, the tension in his shoulders easing by a fraction. He held the cup out to her, the steam curling between them, carrying the sharp, earthy scent of the herbs he had steeped. She eyed it warily, her gaze flicking from his face to the cup and back again. "It'll help," he said, his tone as gentle as he could manage. "For the pain, for the fever." She hesitated, her fingers twitching as if she wanted to reach for the cup, but couldn't quite bring herself to trust him. He stayed still, his hand extended, the cup warm in his palm. Finally she reached out, her hand trembling as her fingers closed around the tin. He released it slowly, watching as she brought it to her lips, her dark eyes never leaving his. She sipped the bitter liquid, her face contorting at the taste, but she forced herself to swallow. He felt a strange, unexpected surge of relief, the tightness in his chest loosening as she took another careful sip. "Good," he murmured, leaning back on his heels. "That's good." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sounds the crackle of the fire and the distant scream of the wind outside. He watched as color slowly returned to her cheeks, her breaths deepening, the faintest hint of strength creeping back into her limbs. "Where?" Her voice was a harsh whisper, her throat clearly parched from days without proper food or water. She winced, her free hand moving to the bandaged wound at her side, her dark brows knitting together in pain. "You're in my cabin," Sawyer said, shifting back to give her space. "I found you out in the snow. You were bleeding, surrounded by wolves." She blinked, her gaze growing sharper, more focused. Her fingers brushed against the rough bandage at her side, and she flinched, her eyes narrowing as if trying to piece together the fractured memories of whatever nightmare had brought her to his door. "You saved me?" she whispered, her voice tinged with disbelief, as if the concept were foreign to her. Sawyer felt a strange, uncomfortable heat creep into his cheeks. He shrugged, leaning back against the wall beside the cot. "Didn't seem right, leaving you out there for the wolves," he said, his voice gruffer than he intended. She looked at him for a long, silent moment, her dark eyes unreadable. Then she let her head fall back against the thin pillow, her eyes slipping shut as the fire crackled on. Sawyer stayed where he was, his hands resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the flickering flames. The storm outside raged on, a relentless, bitter wind tearing at the cabin walls. But inside, the air felt a little warmer, the fire a little brighter, and for the first time in a long while, Sawyer Boone didn't feel quite so alone. The storm had broken, leaving the world outside the cabin covered in a thick, sparkling blanket of fresh snow. The air was sharp and clean, each breath Sawyer took like a blade against his lungs as he stepped out onto the cabin's small porch. The trees stood tall and silent, their branches heavy with white, bending under the weight of winter's fury. It felt like the world had been scrubbed clean, every sound muffled, every movement slowed by the cold. Sawyer tightened his grip on the axe in his hand, his breath steaming in the air as he stepped down into the snow. His boots crunched against the frozen ground, the sound echoing strangely in the stillness. He moved toward the woodpile, setting the axe down and grabbing a few frozen logs, their rough, splintered edges biting into his bare palms. He hadn't thought to grab his gloves on the way out, too focused on the sudden need to clear his mind. Inside, the cabin felt too small, the air too close, the crackling of the fire too loud. He had spent years alone, carving out a life of hard work and quiet solitude, and now there was a stranger in his bed, her dark eyes watching him with a mixture of fear and gratitude he couldn't quite decipher. As he hefted the logs back to the porch, he paused, his breath catching in his throat. Wolf tracks cut through the snow, their prints sharp and deep, circling the cabin like dark, silent sentinels. His grip on the wood tightened, his jaw clenching. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the tree line, the shadows stretching long and cold between the pines. Nothing moved, but the hair on the back of his neck prickled with a primal unease. He dropped the logs on the porch, the sound startlingly loud in the still air. Without a second thought, he snatched up his rifle from where it leaned against the wall just inside the door, stepping back out into the cold. He moved carefully, his boots sinking deep into the snow as he followed the tracks around the side of the cabin, his eyes flicking from shadow to shadow, every muscle in his body tense and ready. The tracks led down the small slope behind the cabin, disappearing into the dense trees that stretched endlessly toward the mountain range in the distance. Sawyer paused at the edge of the woods, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts, his fingers white-knuckled around the rifle's cold, polished stock. He stood there for a long moment, the wind biting at his exposed skin, his eyes locked on the dark, twisted shapes of the trees. The wolves were close, too close. He turned back toward the cabin, his boots crunching in the snow, each step a reminder of the isolation that had once felt like a shield, but now felt more like a trap. As he reached the cabin, he paused, his head turning toward the thin thread of smoke curling up from the chimney. Maya was still inside, her fragile breaths the only sign of life in the otherwise frozen world. He hesitated, his fingers tightening around the rifle. For a moment, he considered the idea of simply walking away, disappearing into the wilderness as he had once dreamed of doing, leaving the cabin, the woman, the wolves behind him. But he didn't. Instead, he stepped back onto the porch, the old creaking boards bending beneath his weight. He set the rifle carefully against the wall, shaking the snow from his shoulders before stepping back inside. The warmth hit him like a wall, his frozen fingers tingling painfully as the blood rushed back into them. He set the logs down beside the fire, the heat from the flames seeping into his bones as he rubbed his hands together, the rough skin scraping against itself. Maya stirred on the cot, her head turning slightly, dark hair falling across her face. He watched her for a moment, the firelight casting deep shadows over her sharp features, her dark eyes fluttering beneath closed lids. She was still alive, still breathing, still clinging to the thin thread of life he had offered her. Sawyer turned to the small pot hanging over the fire, the rich, earthy smell of the stew he had thrown together filling the cabin. He grabbed a tin cup from the small shelf beside the hearth, ladling the thick, steaming liquid into it. He crossed to the cot, kneeling beside Maya and carefully lifting her head. "Here," he murmured, pressing the warm cup to her lips. She blinked, her eyes slowly opening, confusion clouding her gaze for a moment before recognition flickered in the dark depths. She parted her cracked lips, allowing the warm broth to slip past them, her throat working weakly as she swallowed. Sawyer watched her closely, his rough, calloused fingers still supporting her head, his jaw clenched against the strange, unfamiliar surge of relief that twisted in his chest. She took another sip, her eyes never leaving his, the dark, liquid depths filled with a cautious, lingering wariness. "Better?" he asked, his voice gruffer than he intended, the words coming out in a low, rumbling growl. She nodded faintly, her head sinking back against the thin pillow as he lowered her carefully onto the cot. He set the cup aside, his eyes flicking to the small, dark stains spreading across the bandages at her side. The wound was still seeping, the slow, steady trickle of blood a grim reminder of how close to death she still lingered. He felt a strange, uncomfortable twist in his gut, a sharp pang of worry he hadn't expected to feel for a stranger, let alone one who had stumbled into his life bleeding and half dead. Sawyer stood, his hands clenching into fists at his sides, his mind racing with 1,000 unanswered questions. Who was this woman? What had driven her into the frozen wilderness, leaving her for the wolves to find? And why, despite every instinct telling him to let her go, did he feel the need to keep her alive, to protect her? The fire crackled softly, the shadows shifting and dancing against the cabin walls. Sawyer turned back to the door, his eyes narrowing as he stared into the darkness beyond. The wolves were still out there, their tracks fresh in the snow, their eyes likely watching from the shadows. And for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of fear. Not for himself, but for the woman lying on the cot behind him, her breath still coming too shallow, her skin still too pale. Sawyer reached for his rifle, the polished wood cool and familiar in his grip. Whatever was coming for them, he would be ready. The wind had died to a low, mournful whisper by the time Sawyer heard the first crack of a branch outside. He froze, the old chair creaking beneath him as his hand drifted to the rifle leaning against the wall. The fire cast flickering shadows across the cabin, its heat pushing back the cold that seeped through the cracks in the walls. Maya stirred on the cot, her dark eyes opening slowly, blinking against the firelight. She pushed herself up, her face pinched with pain as her hand moved to the bandage at her side. Sawyer glanced at her, catching the fear that flickered across her face before she masked it behind a hardened stare. "Stay here," he whispered, rising from the chair and moving toward the door. He grabbed the rifle, the polished wood cool and solid against his palm, a familiar weight that steadied his racing heart. He paused at the door, his eyes locking with hers for a brief moment, an unspoken understanding passing between them. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, her fingers tightening around the thin blanket draped over her shoulders. Sawyer took a deep breath, the cold air filling his lungs as he eased the door open, stepping out onto the porch. The snow crunched beneath his boots, each step a muted echo in the otherwise silent night. He scanned the tree line, his breath misting in the air as his eyes adjusted to the darkness. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with snow, their shadows stretching long and twisted across the frozen ground. Nothing moved, the only sound the slow, rhythmic creak of the wind as it twisted through the pines. Then he saw it, a flicker of movement in the shadows, a dark shape slipping between the trees, too large to be a wolf, too quick to be anything else. His grip on the rifle tightened, his heart pounding in his chest as he took a slow, deliberate step off the porch, his boots sinking deep into the snow. He moved carefully, his eyes locked on the dark shapes moving through the trees. He counted 3, maybe 4 figures, their forms slipping in and out of the shadows like ghosts. He raised the rifle to his shoulder, the cold metal biting into his cheek as he lined up the sights, his breath coming in slow, controlled bursts. A twig snapped to his left, the sharp, brittle sound cutting through the silence like a blade. He turned, the rifle following his gaze, his finger hovering just above the trigger. He caught a glimpse of dark fur-lined coats, the glint of steel, the faint muted glow of a lantern. His blood ran cold. These weren't wolves, they were men. Sawyer cursed under his breath, his mind racing. He took a step back, his boots crunching loudly in the snow, the sound echoing off the trees. One of the figures turned, the lantern swinging wide, its light cutting a thin, golden line through the darkness. Sawyer's breath caught in his throat as the light swept over him, the shadows clinging to his frame like smoke. The man holding the lantern froze, his eyes locking with Sawyer's, his mouth opening in a silent, wordless gasp. For a long moment, neither of them moved, the air between them charged with a cold, deadly tension. Then the man shouted, his voice sharp and raw in the still night. "Over here! He's here!" Sawyer moved without thinking, his finger tightening on the trigger, the rifle kicking against his shoulder as the shot rang out, the crack echoing through the trees like a cannon blast. The man with the lantern dropped, the light slipping from his grasp and tumbling into the snow, the glass shattering with a faint, crystalline sound. Chaos erupted, the figures in the shadows scattered, their shouts cutting through the darkness as they ducked behind trees, their breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. Sawyer took a step back, his boots sliding in the snow as he swung the rifle toward the second figure, the muzzle flashing as he fired again, a shout of pain, the dull, wet thud of a body hitting the snow. Sawyer stumbled back, his heart racing, his breaths coming in ragged, uneven bursts. He turned, his eyes flicking toward the cabin, the thin line of smoke still curling up from the chimney, the faint glow of the fire visible through the frost-covered window. Maya! He moved quickly, his boots slipping on the icy ground as he sprinted back toward the cabin. Another shot rang out, the bullet whistling past his ear, close enough that he felt the heat of it against his cheek. He ducked, his shoulders slamming into the side of the cabin as he rounded the corner, the rough logs scraping against his coat. He threw the door open, stumbling inside, the warmth of the fire wrapping around him like a thick, suffocating blanket. He kicked the door shut behind him, the sound echoing through the small space, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Maya was already on her feet, her dark eyes wide, her hands clenched into fists as she took a shaky step toward him. "What happened?" she whispered, her voice tight, her body swaying slightly as the blood loss threatened to drag her back down. "Men," he growled, crossing the small cabin in 2 long strides, grabbing his second rifle from the wall and tossing it to her. "They've found us." She caught the rifle, her hands trembling as she fumbled to hold the cold, polished wood steady. He reached for the extra box of ammunition on the small table beside the fire, his mind racing, his pulse thundering in his ears. "We have to move," he said, his voice a low, harsh whisper as he grabbed his coat, slinging it over his shoulders. "Now." Maya hesitated, her eyes darting to the door, to the thin, frost-covered windows, to the rifle in her hands. She took a deep breath, her jaw clenching, the fear in her eyes hardening into something sharper, something stronger. She met his gaze, her dark eyes flashing in the firelight, and gave a small, sharp nod. "Then let's go." Sawyer tightened his grip on the rifle, his teeth gritted, his heart hammering against his ribs. He turned, his hand on the door, his eyes locked on the darkness beyond. Whatever was waiting for them out there, they would face it together. The cold hit them like a fist the moment they stepped outside. The air was sharp, biting at their exposed skin, the snow crunching beneath their boots as they moved quickly through the trees. Sawyer took the lead, his rifle gripped tightly in his hands, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Maya followed close behind, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps, her dark eyes wide, every step a struggle against the pain lancing through her side. The trees closed in around them, their branches heavy with snow, their shadows stretching long and dark across the frozen ground. Sawyer's mind raced, his heart thundering in his chest as he tried to calculate their odds. He had counted at least 4 men outside the cabin, but there could be more, hidden among the trees, their rifles trained on the small clearing where he had built his lonely refuge. A shot rang out, the sharp crack splitting the silence like a blade. Sawyer dropped to one knee, his shoulders slamming against the trunk of a thick pine, snow shaking loose from the branches above him. He turned, his eyes locking with Maya's as she threw herself behind a tree a few feet away, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts, her dark hair clinging to her sweat-soaked forehead. "Keep moving!" he shouted, his voice raw in the cold air, his words carried away by the wind. He swung his rifle up, his eye lining up with the iron sights as he caught a flicker of movement in the trees. He fired, the shot echoing through the forest, the muzzle flash briefly illuminating the twisted, snow-covered branches around them. A figure stumbled into view, his hands clutching at his chest, blood staining the front of his coat a dark, spreading crimson. He fell to his knees, his mouth opening in a silent scream before his body pitched forward into the snow, the sound muffled by the thick, white blanket beneath him. Sawyer didn't wait to see if the man would rise again. He turned, pushing himself back to his feet, his boots slipping on the icy ground as he moved deeper into the forest, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. He heard Maya's footsteps behind him, the crunch of snow, the sharp intake of her breath as she stumbled, caught herself, and kept moving. They broke through the trees, the ground sloping downward, the snow giving way to frozen earth and jagged rocks. Sawyer's boots skidded on the uneven ground, his arms pinwheeling as he fought to keep his balance. He caught a tree branch, his fingers scraping against the rough bark as he swung around, his eyes locking on Maya as she slid down the slope behind him, her rifle clutched tightly to her chest. A second shot rang out, the bullet whistling past Sawyer's ear, close enough that he felt the heat of it against his skin. He threw himself to the ground, his shoulders slamming into the frozen earth, his breath exploding from his lungs in a sharp, painful burst. He rolled onto his back, his rifle snapping up, his eyes locking on the dark figure moving through the trees above him. He fired, the recoil slamming into his shoulder, the muzzle flash briefly blinding him in the darkness. The figure staggered, his body twisting as the bullet slammed into his chest, his rifle slipping from his hands as he crumpled to the ground, his body sliding down the slope, carving a dark, bloody path through the snow. Sawyer scrambled to his feet, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps, his heart thundering in his chest as he turned to find Maya. She had collapsed against a tree, her back pressed to the rough bark, her dark eyes wide, her breath coming in short, shallow pants, her hand clamped tightly over the bandage at her side, blood seeping through her fingers. Sawyer staggered to her side, his hands reaching for her, his fingers clumsy and numb in the cold. "Maya," he whispered, his voice raw, his heart twisting in his chest as he saw the dark, spreading stain across her side. "We have to keep moving." She looked up at him, her dark eyes flashing, her jaw clenched against the pain. She shook her head slowly, her breath coming in short, shuddering gasps. I can't," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath, her hand slipping from the wound at her side, her blood staining the snow beneath her. Sawyer felt a cold, hard knot form in his chest, his hands clenching into fists as he looked down at her, his mind racing, his heart thundering in his ears. He couldn't leave her. Not here, not like this. But if he stayed, if he tried to defend her, they would both die, their bodies lost in the snow, their bones picked clean by wolves. "Don't you dare," he growled, his voice rough, his teeth gritted, his eyes hard. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh as he hauled her to her feet, her body limp and uncooperative in his grasp. "Don't you dare give up," she gasped, her body swaying against him, her dark eyes locking with his, a flash of defiance flickering across her face. She nodded, her jaw tightening, her hands clenching into fists as she forced her feet to move, her steps stumbling and awkward, her breaths coming in short, sharp gasps. They moved together, their bodies leaning into each other for support, their boots slipping and sliding on the icy ground as they stumbled down the slope, the sound of gunshots still echoing through the trees behind them. Sawyer felt the cold seeping into his bones, his fingers numb around the rifle, his breaths coming in short, ragged bursts. But he kept moving, his eyes locked on the dark, twisted shapes of the trees ahead, the faint, flickering glow of the rising sun cutting through the branches. As they reached the bottom of the slope, the trees opened up, the ground leveling out into a wide, frozen plain, the wind cutting across the snow like a blade. Sawyer staggered to a stop, his breaths coming in short, gasping pants, his heart thundering in his chest as he turned to look at Maya. She met his gaze, her dark eyes wide, her breaths coming in short, shuddering gasps, her hand still clamped tightly over the wound at her side. She gave a small, sharp nod, her jaw clenched, her eyes flashing with a fierce, stubborn fire. "Keep going," she whispered, her voice rough, her breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. "Don't stop." Sawyer nodded, his jaw clenched, his teeth gritted, his eyes hard. He took a deep breath, his fingers tightening around the rifle in his hands as he turned back to the darkness ahead, his boots crunching in the snow as he took the first stumbling step into the unknown. They would keep moving. They would survive. And together they would carve a place for themselves in the cold, unforgiving wilderness. If you were caught in a snowstorm, surrounded by wolves and hunted by ruthless men, would you keep fighting? Would you risk it all for a stranger? Tell me, what would you have done in Sawyer's place? And do you think Maya can survive the harsh winter with her wounds and a past still chasing her through the snow? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear how you think this story should continue. Don't forget to hit like if you enjoy this tale and subscribe for more Wild West stories that keep you on the edge of your seat. Until next time, stay warm out there.